Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome this evening to the Baker Institute. I'm the director of the Institute. I'm pleased to welcome you to the Baker Institute Civic Scientist Lecture Series event with our keynote speaker, Dr. Bruce Alberts. As editor-in-chief of Science, Dr. Alberts oversees one of the world's most prestigious scientific journals, and we are honored that he can join us. Support for tonight's program has been provided by a generous gift from Marathon Oil Corporation. We are grateful for Marathon's commitment to public education and for its support of this lecture series. We would also like to welcome tonight Dr. Dan Carson, Dean of Weiss School of Natural Sciences, and Dr. Sally Keller McNulty, Dean of Engineering, who was our first Rice faculty member to visit a local high school as part of our Civic Science program. The Civic Scientist Lectures are a series of talks by leading scientists from around our country who have influenced public policy. The lectures seek to encourage scientists and future scientists to expand their roles beyond the laboratory. It also gives the Houston community an opportunity to hear leading scientists discuss their fields and their careers with the goal of promoting science and technology as a public priority worthy of federal, state, and local funding. Previous lecture series speakers include Dr. Arden Beaumont, the Director of National Science Foundation and a key player in science policy and research funding, and Dr. Shirley Ann Jackson, the first African-American woman to receive a doctorate in any subject at MIT, now the president of Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. In addition to the lecture series, we are happy to announce a new public and educational outreach initiative, the Civic Scientist Outreach Program. This initiative, also made possible by Marathon Oil Corporation's support for the Civic Scientist Lecture Series, will take scientists and engineers from Rice University to engage with students at local high schools. These academic leaders will educate young people in the Houston community both about the value of science, math, and engineering in their everyday lives and about the exciting number of career opportunities in these critical areas of study. Achievement in math and science among America's school children is a point of serious concern for both education and business leaders. It's a key national priority, or should be. Kindergarten through 12th grade students need to be inspired to study science, see the relationship between what they study and the world around them, and fill the gap in the production of engineers, technologists, scientists, and mathematicians in the United States. The Civic Scientist Program is convened by the Baker Institute Science and Technology Program. The mission of the Science and Technology Program is to provide a space for policymakers and scientists to engage in substantive dialogue with the hope that policy will more accurately reflect and be more consistent with current scientific knowledge. The program's research and projects include science education, advice to policymakers, biomedical research and policy, and healthcare disparities. Through these projects, we discuss topics such as improving international scientific collaborations, climate change, funding of scientific research and development, and the uninsured in Texas. The program is run by Dr. Neil Lane, Senior Fellow in Science and Technology Policy and a Malcolm Gillis University Professor at Rice, and Dr. Kirsten Matthews, Fellow in Science and Technology Policy. The idea for the Civic Scientist Lecture Series actually comes from a concept that Neil Lane promoted while working as Director of the National Science Foundation and Science Advisor to President Clinton. Dr. Lane envisioned the civic scientist as a true scientist who uses his or her knowledge, accomplishments, and analytic skills to help bridge the gap between science and society. Dr. Lane exemplifies these principles, as does our speaker today, who Dr. Lane will now introduce. Join me in welcoming Dr. Lane to the podium.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I'm delighted to join the Ambassador in welcoming you all this evening to Rice University and the Baker Institute for our annual Civic Scientist Lecture, which will be given by Dr. Alberts. At the Baker Institute, we define a civic scientist in the way that Dr. Djurigian described, and he gives me too much credit. It wasn't really my idea to start talking about this idea and talking about this notion when I was in Washington. I got the notion from a speechwriter. You know, you have to give a talk every day. You have to give a talk someplace or other. And I had this great speechwriter, and she used to work for former Congressman George Brown of California, whom some of you may know, a great champion of science. And George, about 30 years ago, said that scientists really need to get out of their laboratories more, out with the public, out with the policymakers. They need to become more politically active. And so she sort of wrote me up a talk based on that. I liked the idea and have enjoyed talking about it ever since. So what about some examples of civic scientists? Of course, those who've given our lectures that Ed Djurigian told you about. But one such civic scientist was Benjamin Franklin. He helped create a nation, of course, so he really went out of his way to extend his fame. He gave up his science, which he loved, and spent some time, first of all, trying to repair a relationship with the king, but that did not work out, and so we had a new nation. He was the first American scientist. He was a serious scientist in his experiments on electricity, and of course the first civic scientist. Neither Bruce nor I knew him personally. The late and great Rick Smalley, a Nobel laureate, Rice University, used his prestige and his knowledge to educate the public and policymakers about the looming energy crisis that he thought we faced, and he was absolutely right, and that he felt we needed new technologies to deal with, nanotechnology being his favorite. Bruce and I did know Rick Smalley. And of course our speaker tonight, Bruce Alberts, whose tireless work over several decades has helped to promote sound public policy, international scientific collaboration, science and math education, and many other areas that are so vital to human welfare. Dr. Alberts has had a remarkable career, and I can only give you a snippet in this introduction. He received his doctorate at Harvard, began his early career at Princeton, and after 10 years he moved to the University of California, San Francisco, one of the nation's premier medical research institutions, as a professor and vice chair of the Department of Biochemistry and Biophysics. He was really a physicist. He is especially well known for his research achievements in biochemistry, in particular the work he's done on protein complexes which allow chromosomes to be replicated. He's also one of the original authors of The Molecular Biology of the Cell, considered the leading textbook of its kind and used widely in U.S. colleges and universities, including Rice. It's also a very heavy book. In addition, Dr. Alberts has been committed, passionate, I would say, about improving science education, dedicating much of his time for many, many years to educational projects such as City Science, a program seeking to improve science teaching in San Francisco elementary schools. From 1995 to 2005, he served as the president of the U.S. Academy of Sciences, and during his tenure at the Academy, he also served as co-chair of the Inter-Academy Council, which he helped found, a new advisory institution in Amsterdam governed by presidents of 15 science academies from all around the world. During this time, he also served on the advisory board of the National Science Resources Center, a joint project with the National Academy of Sciences and the Smithsonian, working with teachers, scientists, and school systems to improve teaching of science as well. And as well, he served on the National Academy of Sciences National Committee on Science Education Standards and Assessment. Following his service as president of the National Academies, and after a brief stint back at the University of California, where I don't think he got any rest, he accepted a position as the editor-in-chief of Science magazine. I think you know Science is the top journal in the world in many of the most important areas of scientific research. It has the largest paid circulation of any general science journal in the world. When Alberts was named as the new editor-in-chief, John Holdren, whom you may know President Obama has appointed as his science advisor, called the appointment a real coup. Holdren said the following, quote, "Bruce has a wide-ranging intellect, tremendous energy, superb judgment, and a fine editorial hand. He combines these assets with a deep belief in the importance of strengthening science and engineering in global society as a key to improving the human condition," end of quote. That certainly describes the Bruce Alberts I know. Finally, on a personal note, Bruce and I arrived in Washington around the same time. Neither of us had had much experience working with the federal government and the ways of Washington. We both experienced some surprises, some frustrations, some disappointments. In the end, I think, many rewards as well. I greatly valued Bruce's sound advice, his dedication to getting things done, his basic humanity, and even our shared commiseration on occasion. So thank you, Bruce, for that. And tonight, Bruce will be addressing issues of particular concern to him, and I think all of us who are here. Science and math education, maybe education more broadly. The title of his talk is Redefining Science Education and the Role that Scientists Play in Society. Please welcome Dr. Bruce Alberts.
Well, thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm a great admirer of Neil's, and I couldn't resist his invitation. We did spend a lot of time in Washington together, and I think we both learned a lot. Actually, this is 12 years of education that I had. Actually, it was a privilege. I think the way all of us should think about life is an education. And so what we're preparing kids to do in school is to continue learning after they graduate. I see some students over here. It's not over when you get your PhD degree even. So what did I learn? The most important thing, I learned many things, but is that science is much more important even than most scientists think. Most scientists have their head down in their laboratory, focused on very important to them and maybe important to the world, dissection of a small, tiny bit of our universe. And they don't have enough time, usually, to think about larger issues. And certainly that was the case for me before I went to Washington. But being president of the Academy, that was my job, and I actually got exposed to a lot of things that I didn't know before. More specifically, it's critically important that science and scientists achieve a much higher degree of influence, both throughout their nations and the world. The Inter-Academy Council that I am still the co-chair. First I was co-chair with the Indian Academy president, and now with the Chinese Academy president. I end on March. End of March, and you know, I'll only have 3 half-time jobs instead of 4. Basically is designed to help that happen by encouraging scientists everywhere to step up, as Neil has done, to actually serve their nations and exert their influence on their governments. And of course, it's also important for building a better world. In particular, the whole world needs much more of the creativity, rationality, openness, and tolerance that are inherent to science. What Indian Prime Minister Nehru in 1950 called a scientific temper for both the United States and all other nations. I think Nehru's emphasis on science and scientific temper really explains India's position in the world today as a scientific powerhouse and its success. And he also recognized that this scientific temper was essential to his nation, which is India's at least as diverse as the United States. And to keep that nation together, they needed the tolerance that would come from this scientific temper. So 3 ambitious goals that I would say for science education for all Americans is, first of all, to enable all children to acquire the problem-solving, thinking, and communication skills of scientists so that they can be productive and competitive in the new world economy. Most of them, the vast majority, will not be scientists, but they need these same skills. Second, to generate this scientific temper for our nation with scientifically trained people in many professions. I like to talk about the scientific temper in contemporary terms as enabling our citizens to be resistant to the temptations of talk radio. Simplistic answers for complex problems. It's not only talk radio, of course, it's all the internet scams, it's all the other horrible things that modern communication can tempt us with. And if we're going to have a rational society, we need people who can think carefully about what they hear on talk radio and ask whether there's any evidence, what's the rationality. And that's the broadest way to think of, for me, of the kind of science education I'd like to see. And of course, help the United States generate new scientific knowledge and technology by casting the widest possible net for talent. We all know that there are talented people in all parts of our society. Most of them never have a chance to experience or to show what they can do. And science needs to bring these people into our leadership positions. So I claim that we need nothing less than a revolution. I'm a kind of a radical kind of person, but I've come to realize that we really need to redefine what we mean by the term science education, because it's misdefined, and that confuses people and prevents most of us from being able to effectively transmit the message we want to transmit. So part of my education, as Neil implied, was working on the National Science Education Standards. My first 2 years at the Academy, I think I spent half my time on this incredibly huge project. It's by far the most difficult report that the Academy ever wrote. It was, usually we have 15 reviewers for our report. This one had 18,000 reviewers, and it took a year to revise the first draft and produce this 250-page report. I urge everybody to read the 25 pages about teaching. There's such a misconception in this country about what teaching is and how difficult it is. I'm surprised. I keep repeatedly encounter people who think that if you know a subject, you could teach it. You know, for example, in California right now, we have this controversial new state board policy that suddenly all 8th graders have to take algebra. And we don't have the teachers to teach all 8th graders algebra, but there are many people, and these must be the people on the state board who are included here, who think that if you've once learned algebra, you could teach it. And that is such a misconception about the nature of teaching. And I like to very much emphasize, and I will emphasize, the importance of teaching for our nation's future and the importance of that profession. So we found out, because of the way we teach college science, our teachers didn't really know how to teach according to National Science Education Standards, because the standards emphasize science teaching as enabling students to ask questions and do active inquiry, it's called. And since most teachers, all teachers, have taken their science from college courses, most of them had never experienced inquiry themselves, and so this is the guide that we had to produce, the supplement to the standards. And this is a classroom, middle school classroom in San Francisco, noisy, kids working in groups, actively exploring with the teacher as a coach, and that's what we want for science education in schools. It's empowering, it's motivating for students, and it teaches them the skills they need. This is just an example I find is useful to explain what when I'm talking. This is a 5-year-old. When I left San Francisco, this was the official curriculum for 5-year-olds, kindergartens in San Francisco. Put on clean white socks and walk around the schoolyard. You do this in the spring. In your class, you collect all the black specks that are stuck to your socks and try to classify them. Now, you know that seeds are designed to stick to animal fur, so they'll stick to the socks. But most of the stuff, most of the black specks are not going to be seeds, they're going to be dirt. So how could you figure out which are which? That's the class, kindergarten kids. And the teachers, not to tell them the answer, but they give them a little plastic microscope and ask them to draw a picture of all the specks, put them in the middle and classify them. And eventually the class will suggest that the regularly spaced, the ones that are regularly shaped, those might be the seeds. And then the next question is from the teacher, how would you test this idea? And again, the teacher's not supposed to tell the class. Somebody will eventually come up with the idea, you should plant the two kinds. We'll plant the ones we think are dirt and plant the ones that we think are seeds and test our hypothesis. Now this is really science, but this is the kind of thing that even 5-year-olds can do. So the vision is to have an education that involves solving hundreds of such challenges over the course of the 13 years of schooling before high school graduation. And of course, these challenges would be much more difficult as the children age, and we already have these curricula. They've been developed and refined in the United States for about 50 years, starting with post-Sputnik era. In fact, many of them are more widely used in other countries than they're used here. France is, led by the French Academy of Sciences, has got something like half of all of France doing this kind of science in their elementary schools. So I believe that children who are prepared for life in this way would be great problem solvers in the workplace, and even more important, they'd be more rational human beings, resistant to talk radio. So 10 years after we did this, the standards at the Academy, just before I left, I had the privilege of appointing this committee. We decided we should look back what had happened in the previous 10 years and what did we learn from research, what did we learn from the standards. And this is the update of the National Science Education Standards, and it's called Taking Science to School. And then there was a popular version published, Ready, Set, Science, for states, school districts, and teachers. And the critical thing is that this distinguished committee of researchers and scientists argued that to be proficient in science, students should be expected to master 4 different strands of science learning, and importantly, each of the 4 strands is equally important to the other one. The first is to know, use, and interpret scientific explanations of the natural world. The second is to generate and evaluate scientific evidence and explanations. The third is to understand the nature and development of scientific knowledge. And the fourth is to participate productively in scientific practices and discourse. Now, I think we should all unite around this redefinition of science education, because this country is, frankly, a mess. We produced the National Science Education Standards, and then each state was supposed to use those as the guidelines for their own site standards. And when that happened, everything went nuts. Every state had their own factions wanting their own things. In California, for example, we have all middle school children memorizing all the parts of a cell. It's my field, cell biology. The National Science Education Standards specifically said this was not worth doing. But, you know, Back to Basics movement said that these people said that the Academy standards were too soft. In Virginia, they have all these things about mud cracks. I never even heard of mud cracks, but anyway, each state has their own idiosyncratic stuff. The good news is that inquiry-based science education precisely fits the needs for workforce skills that have been widely expressed by U.S. business and industry. Unfortunately, our CEOs, most of them don't know this, but there have been very thoughtful studies, such as published in a book called Thinking for a Living, which analyze what industry really needs from its high school graduates. If you read those, you realize that this kind of science education is perfect for producing those kinds of skills. The bad news, of course, is that most science education in the United States is not like the science education I've been talking about. What we usually do in science class is just part of the first strand. Basically, the students should know scientific explanations of the natural world. I was profoundly affected, and maybe my college colleagues who teach science will be too, by a series of focus groups that the National Academy of Sciences ran before we produced the last edition, published about a year ago, of a book that is published every 10 years on, called Science, Evolution, and Creationism, trying to, is a topic very dear to Texans' hearts, since you still have these disputes every few years. But what we did is we hired a bunch of people who run focus groups, the same people who run, you know, try to figure out how to sell soap. And they took groups of, I guess, 10 or 15 people, adults, all college graduates, and had them discuss their attitudes about science and religion and all that. And they fed back to us to help us guide the production of the next edition of this book. That I was on that committee. I was no longer president of the Academy. But the profoundly disturbing thing that this focus group found is that these college-educated adults saw no difference between science and religion. Both were presented to them, had been presented to them as revealed truth. And if you think about the way I and others teach college science, or used to teach it, We sort of take it for granted that the students understand where this comes from, but it turns out they don't. It's just the scientist version of the world, and there's another version of the world, and there's no understanding of these other strands that are so essential if we're going to actually have science spread in this country effectively. Here's just an example. I think examples are useful. Science education is mentioning. This is from an actual 7th grade life sciences textbook. I have grandchildren, so I read these things. Running through the cell, this is one of my favorite organelles, endoplasmic reticulum, but I didn't learn about it till graduate school. Running through the cells of a network of flat channels called the endoplasmic reticulum, that's the bold-faced word, there's 6 bold-faced words per page. This organelle manufactures, stores, and transports materials. The next sentence is about the Golgi apparatus with another such sentence, and on and on. This is the hardest book I've ever read because there's nothing that you could keep in your head. But to make it clear to students what we mean by education, we have a chapter self-test, 16 pages later. Here's the test. Write a sentence that uses the term endoplasmic reticulum correctly. So do we wonder why kids get turned off of school? This is not education. I mean, even if they could write it then, in another 5 weeks, they wouldn't be able to write it. It's not, if it doesn't stick in your head, it's not education. Here's the California 5th grade sample test. They proudly put this on the website as an example of what 5th graders will be tested. Now, I want you to know, first of all, that there's no right answer to this question, but because the people who wrote it didn't understand what electron microscopes could do, but that's all right. But more importantly, it's not science. Is this science to know different machines? What does that have to do with science anyway? It's impossible to embarrass these people. So an important challenge of the No Child Left Behind Act, as you all know, that high-stakes science assessments are now required in every state. It's much easier and cheaper to test for science words than for science understandings and abilities. Bad tests are forcing a trivialization of science education and driving most students, including many potential scientists, away from science. And I would say the critical criterion for a good test is one that motivates good teaching and learning. And we need to do research on our tests, invest in them, and find out, create tests. It's a critical issue. To create tests that drive good teaching and learning should be the fundamental issue about our assessments. We're losing many potential scientists because real science is exciting and completely different from these tests and textbooks. So what I did with my grandson, who at age 12 thought he wanted to be a scientist, and then he took a life science course in 7th grade, and decided, no, I don't want to be a scientist, it's horrible. If you have that experience, there's a wonderful series of books that were published by the academies. They're short biographies written in narrative form, they're exciting like a novel, about 10 different living women scientists called Women's Inventors in Science. And I gave these to my grandson, and now he wants to be a scientist again. And he didn't even notice they were all women. Actually, but this is a wonderful resource if you want to, and it can be read by adults. They're actually very nice. And because these are living women scientists, there are pictures of these people at the same age as the students who are reading the book. So it has a real connection to real people. So here's my latest editorial from Science, and this is where the title of this talk comes from, Redefining Science Education. And I argue that major change is needed, and the change has to start. Unfortunately, for the people in this room who are professors, science education at the college level must change. So this is the diagram of our education. Poor teachers have all the arrows pointing at them. It's a grid. This is from an old academy report. But many of us think we have nothing to do with this problem. We blame the unions or something else. But basically, we're the ones who teach. Well, people who be teachers science, and that defines what science is for them. And you can't teach something you've never experienced yourself. And we also teach all the parents who think that's what science education should be for their children. The Academy tried very hard to publish reports, so did the National Science Foundation. I think Neil was there at the time, saying that what kind of science education we really need. None of that worked. College professors do not read books. But we then decided to have a summer workshop for teams of Biology 1 teachers at the University of Wisconsin. This is for teams of biology teachers from research universities. And this brings together teams every summer to work on talking about Biology 1 education, first year. And this is me, I visited it once, learning how to use clickers, which I later used in my medical school class at UCSF. But this seems to be having an effect because, this sort of getting excited about what's possible in biology class from other people. In education, we always reinvent the wheel. We never do what we do in science, which is see what the best things going on elsewhere and then trying to reproduce them. And this is an attempt to, I think, a successful test attempt to change that dynamic. So my message for professors is that the primary aim of any undergraduate science course, whether in biology, chemistry, physics, or earth sciences, should be to enable students to appreciate and participate in science as a special way of knowing about the world. So when they become part of a focus group later as adults, they will understand where science comes from, where this knowledge comes from. So we also need to do what I call make a science out of science education. The goal here is to use knowledge of what increases student learning based on scientifically obtained evidence to create a continuously improving education system at all levels. So the Academy, when I was there, made this wonderful attempt to harvest what we know about how people learn from 30 years of research in psychology departments. Unfortunately, it just sat in psychology departments and never reached the school. And this was a very successful attempt to harvest what we know and say what does it mean for students in schools. And this is widely used now in teacher preparation courses. So we need a more focused and effective system of education research so we could actually inform our systems better. We don't have enough research on things that really matter to school. Much of the new research must be focused on the classroom, building from what our best teachers already know. Otherwise, we'll continue to be in this mess where a new superintendent comes every 2 years or so to urban district and they have a new solution. New leaders seeking a quick fix. There are no quick fixes in education. So the National Academies tried to see how we could help and produced this, I think, very important report called the Strategic Education and Research Partnership. The major question posed was, why has research supported innovation and continuous improvement in medicine, agriculture, and transportation, but not in education, and what can we do about it? And here was the answer. Education is missing the equivalent of the teaching hospital in medicine, that is, field sites. Places where researchers, teachers, and designers work in practice settings to observe, explain, document, replicate, and evaluate practice as a source of new knowledge, define problems and test solutions in context, and train a new generation of graduate students and postdocs as researchers and practitioners for what we call use-inspired research and development. The first field site was in Boston because the member of the committee, the Academy Committee, was Tom Pezant, former high-ranking official in the Department of Education under Bill Clinton, and later superintendent of schools of Boston. And the school district identified something I never even heard of. Middle school literacy, it turns out, is a very much under-researched area. It turns out kids get to high school and get these textbooks, they can read them. If they read them, you'd think they were reading them, but they don't understand them. And how do you get kids to actually read for understanding? Has not been a major focus of education research. Much of the research has been on how to get people to the 4th grade level. And so this field site has been developing new tools and bringing together groups of researchers. In San Francisco, decided to focus on middle school math and science. This is a picture of about 1/3 of the people in the room during a design team meeting in San Francisco. Half these people are professors, graduate students from Stanford, Berkeley, UCSF, and the other half are school district personnel who are responsible for science or for middle school principals and so on. These are wonderful day-long meetings in which the faculty or professors or researchers are excited by the fact that finally their knowledge is going to be used, and it's actually helping them understand what the school district needs and how to change their research. And the school district people are so happy to have the chance to think long-term for a change. Anybody in a school district knows it's always one emergency after the other. Okay, so this is the website for SERP. Anybody wants to know, and that's a picture of Tom Pezant, who was, again, a very key member of the committee and the person who attracted the first field site as San Francisco. So I want to end with the issue of teacher empowerment, because this is a critical issue for us all. About 40 years ago, U.S. industry learned from the Japanese that building a better automobile requires listening to workers on the assembly line. That is, ground truth is essential for wise decision making. And all of U.S. industry, first the car industry, but the rest of U.S. industry now is attuned to the customers and to the people making whatever they're manufacturing on the assembly line. Education is one of the few places in our society that has failed to exploit this kind of wisdom. So what keeps me up at night is that our best science teachers need to have much more influence on the education system. Current trends will drive these talented people into much more lucrative and respected careers. These are people who spent their whole life studying kids, and we think they don't have something to tell us about how to run an education system. This influence is needed at every level, from school districts to states to the federal government. How can we institutionalize such an influence is needed to create a continuously improving education system. This is something that took me a long time to realize would be effective. We formed a National Teacher Advisory Council at the academies. Only in my last 3 years. I had been putting teachers on all these committees studying education, but of course academics are used to talking over teachers, and the dynamic didn't really work. Often the teacher's voice was not heard. So the idea was to have a separate group that would advise us on, in addition to the teachers on the committee, have a separate strong voice to advise our education reports from a group of really outstanding teachers. Subsequently, California formed a similar teacher advisory council. A week ago, we were in Sacramento trying to interface with the policymakers who make state policy, who need to know what's happening in the schools but don't. And I would suggest that Texas also needs such a. So this is the end of my talk. Science education should have a much larger role in all school systems, but only if this science education is of a different kind than is experienced in most schools today. Secondly, making such a change will require a redefinition of science education. This redefinition must begin at the college level. Colleges set the tone and have the prestige that define what science education is. Thirdly, to create continually improving education systems, we will need much more collaborative, effective, and use-inspired education research that's focused on real school needs and that integrates our best school teachers into the work. And fourth, our best teachers need to have a much larger voice in helping to steer our state policies and our school systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bruce. We have microphones up front. We'd like you to come to the microphone and ask questions so that everyone can hear you, and also so that you will be recorded for posterity. Let me start with a question while people are working their way to the microphones. Do work your way to the microphones. So Bruce, my question is, seems to me it's very easy to test just facts-based education, like how many chromosomes or how many this or that. Looks like to me like it's not so easy to test the kind of science learning you're talking about.
So this is a very good question. So there are talented people in this country who've been doing this. Rich Shavelson, for example, at Stanford. The Gates Foundation has announced their new policy, got lots of money to spend, and they want to focus on creating new kinds of assessments that will actually drive good teaching and learning. So my way of doing this, I've been trying to interact with the Gates Foundation, is to tell them that you've got to do this by making this an issue of national service. I mean, it's such an important task that, you know, the kind of people who will just apply for grants from the Gates Foundation, none of my scientific colleagues who, for example, worked on the the standards. We had 40 members of the Academy working on the standards. None of them are going to be applying for grants to work on these science assessments. It's not something they want to do, but it's something we need to do. And we need to get the very best people in the country. And Rich Shabelson made a whole list of these people. They're good people. And the very best people from the science side together with outstanding teachers and really make this the kind of thing that we had post-Sputnik. Post-Sputnik, some of our most distinguished scientists took off for 2 months every summer to work on creating new textbooks. I think we have an opportunity to do the same thing. You know, I got a gazillion things on my calendar, but if they called me and say, I want you to come all August to work on this thing, you know, if it looked like it was well designed, I could do that. So we need real leadership on this issue because it's not easy, but it's also not impossible because there's been a lot of work done. In fact, most of the work that's been done on this has been done in the United States. Yeah.
There was some articles in the American Scientist magazine about, you know, at the end of the American Scientist, they have how you can sort of hire a scientist to come and give a talk, but they had some guys, professors, who would go to these schools and give some talks to the different students. How did that ever turn out? I mean, did that stimulate people or run them off?
Well, I know a lot about this. I don't know about this particular example. We have a major science education partnership at UCSF that's been around 20 years. And you don't want scientists to walk into teachers' classroom and start talking over the heads of the students and over the head of the teacher, embarrassing the teacher, in fact. So what works is to make a partnership. We have, actually, they're called, first they were one-on-one partnerships between scientists and teachers, and now they've evolved to be 2 and 2. 2 scientists and 2 teachers, we have something like 300 volunteers every year from UCSF doing this, mostly students and postdocs. And they do what the teacher wants, not what they want to do, and help the teacher have access to resources and support the teacher, not embarrass the teacher. So I would guess that this experiment was a massive failure because before we let scientists in the classroom in San Francisco, we run a training session for them, how to act and what not to do. The last thing we need are arrogant scientists going there and making the teacher, first of all, going completely over the head of the students, not understanding the students, just lecturing, which is not the best way to teach. That's what we do in college. And secondly, of course, embarrassing the teacher because the teacher can't answer the questions that the children have about the scientist's talk. Hey, Bill. Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, let's start on the right.
There's a large body of literature and research done in the school health area that uses really strong design, school-based randomized trials. Of course, that's like 10 schools per condition,
Yeah.
Very expensive.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, I know there's been some talk about that in the education field, going to the more rigorous
Yes.
evaluation designs. How to do that? Is there money? And 2, there's also a group through NIH, the Science Education Partnership Awards. Do you know about that group?
Yes.
Because they're
Yes.
working closely, the scientists and the teachers together.
So there's a wonderful website for math science partnerships maintained by all these groups of universities with these such partnerships, grants from both the NSF and the Department of Education. The issue you're talking about was a matter of huge political debate in Washington when I was there under the first Bush administration. It went from one extreme to another. It was argued that the only kind of education research that mattered was double-blind random assignment trials. So I actually was asked to give a talk at one of these things where everybody had religion on this thing, and I tried to say the opposite. I said that, from my field of medicine, biomedicine, what are you going to do the trial on? You need to have some knowledge about what we're going to test. These tests are enormously expensive. We can only do a few of them. So we need a mixture of different kinds of research. And I was reflecting a report from the Academy called Scientific Research in Education. By the way, all the reports I'm talking about are freely available on the Academy website. So this report was done maybe 2004. 2003, Scientific Research and Education, which basically had a mixture of scientists and education researchers trying to argue we need a whole broad spectrum of different kinds of education research. Sure, the ideal thing is a randomized, large-scale trial, enormously expensive, as it is in medicine. But you need the knowledge, what to do those trials on from other kinds of research, which are incredibly important before you could actually spend your money well on such trials. Yeah. Bill?
Oh, thank you, Bruce, for coming. Science education's in a mess in Texas, too, by the way, not just in the nation.
Oh, so. I thought you were perfect.
Listen, we just completed a study here of our science education that the members of the National Academy of Texas got together, an organization called TAMIST, and we've studied this for 2 years. And we have a report, but basically what I chaired that committee, co-chaired it with Marianne Rankin of UTeach. And the paradox I see is, how did America become such a leader in science with more Nobel laureates, I believe, than any other nation, when our science education has been so bad for so long?
First of all, America has this great advantage is that World War II wiped out everybody. There was no competition. All the best scientists came here, which gave us a big head start. Because learning scientists, to be a scientist is an apprenticeship. So all these great scientists were here, and they trained another generation of scientists, and so on. There wasn't any competition. This is changing dramatically. So we've been sleeping. So our past can't be used to predict the future. And of course, there will always be people who, no matter what kind of education they get, will manage to survive, you know, by going to museums or something. What we want, though, is to have many more people to have a chance to survive. I think it's a critical issue. Scientists are vastly underrepresented in communities that don't have parents who are already academics. And I know exactly why that is, because I happened to be in my friend's house when his son was studying for the chemistry AP exam, and I was looking at the kind of things he had to study. It was incredibly boring, balancing one equation after another. Why should anybody be interested? Well, my son's son was doing it because his father said, get over this, it'll be better when you get to college. You need to do this when you get to college. But nobody's telling these other kids to do that, so why should they do it? I mean, so we have to make education interesting and motivating. When I was a student, there was no competition. School was about the most interesting thing there was. I still remember trying to, you know, we had like 2 hours of television and watching Howdy Doody. It was not very interesting. But now kids have access to everything. So why should they care about school unless we make it motivating? And what we've done is just the opposite. I was had dinner with a teacher, in one of the star science teachers in the Teacher Advisory Council in California just a week ago. And she was telling me, well, her school's now been put under PI, program improvement or whatever it's called. It's penalized. So now there's no time for any art, no time for any recess, nothing. We have 2 double periods of reading drill, double periods of math drill, and I want to teach science, but there's no way I could teach it. My principal won't let me teach science. This is crazy. So the net result is that students are dropping out of school. They're not even coming. Why should they come for that? So we have to make school interesting, and science is a great way of making school interesting and motivating. My favorite, I'm pushing a major experiment. I'm sure it would be successful. Scientists should never say this because we're always testing things. But to take 2 of the PI schools in San Francisco, which have failed forever, and center them around active science learning, spin off from that reading, writing, everything, mathematics, and then compare that to a companion school and see what happens. We have to do it for 5 or 10 years so we can see what happens to these kids. I think we could sell science education in this current environment as being not only for learning how to solve problems and use evidence, but also to learn how to read, write, and communicate. There are actually studies that show that this is a very powerful way of teaching kids who don't even know languages, ESL kids. But no, what we have in these PI schools, we got these kids. This teacher was telling me, well, we have the school district bought this program. We got to sing songs with them. they're supposed to sing songs, "You Are My Sunshine" or something like that, and the kids thought it was a joke. It's a complete waste of time. And this teacher actually had volunteered the year before to teach this stuff, and so she really knew. And she went to her principal after 1 month and said, "The kids are turned off. This is not doing anything. I have a better idea. Can I do this?" "No, you got to use this curriculum." I mean, how are we going to keep good people in teaching or have a successful system with that kind of attitude? Sorry.
Well, many years ago, when I was a graduate student, my research advisor was on a committee asked by the San Francisco school system to devise a curriculum for secondary school science education. And they recommended that science education should start with physics, and then go to chemistry, and then to biology, which makes a great deal of sense to me. Whatever happened to that idea?
Well, it's been around a lot. I mean, Leon Letterman pushed very hard, physics first. San Diego actually went through the whole system, shifted the physics first for at least a while. When I went to high school, I went to public high school near Chicago, we had an integrated science course the first year, which made a lot of sense. I learned enough about atoms and molecules and basic laws of physics and chemistry to then take biology the next year. Now we have this crazy thing. Either biology should not be the first year, or it should not have all that molecular stuff in it. If it's molecular biology and you don't know any chemistry, I've got relatives doing this stuff. This is in Bethesda. My sister's daughter, she was memorizing the structure of ATP for the exam. And I discovered, this was first year of high school, I discovered that she had memorized it, but she had no idea what these things meant. What was a C in a line and a C? Just memorizing things. And this is a great way to make kids think education is a meaningless activity designed for adults to torture them. I mean, nobody's looking. This is a crazy thing. You have to know what an atom is before you memorize the structure of ATP if you're going to do it. And right now, our system is not set up appropriately.
Yes, I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of your lecture, so I don't know if you... Oh, so sorry. So I don't know if you addressed this issue, but how does one deal with the volume and the depth of knowledge in science that is now that we're confronted with today, and to present it in a fun way?
So, this starts in college. In college, Biology 1 has to set the example. I'm a biologist, so I'll talk about that. So we have to decide a few core things that we're going to teach well, and not try to cover everything scientists have learned about biology. It was ridiculous 10 years ago. Now we have 4 times as much. It's even more ridiculous now. So the 4 strands of learning that were stressed in the Academy report called Taking Science to School, I think we all have to focus on that all the way from kindergarten through college. There's no way you could teach people science in a way that is motivating and appropriate for getting them to understand what science is without greatly reducing the amount of material that you're teaching in a Biology 1 course. And that also applies all the way down to high school. So I think that we need to go back to as far as the K-12 system, go back to the national standards idea. I'm actually on the commission that's trying to make such recommendations, the Carnegie Commission, and just reinterpret that in terms of what actually the experience has been in the school. I'm a scientist, so you try to design a strategy to sort of make some progress no matter what, no matter how confusing it is. So the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics had a project after all these math standards to do something called math focal points, to basically stream down what kids were supposed to know, because compared to all other countries, we have way too much coverage and not enough depth. And so they have these math focal points, which apparently are being pretty effective. We have to see learn from how they're implied. But so I think for science, we have to do the same thing. We have to look at the standards, the national standards and the benchmarks and all that stuff, and make a set of really core concepts that we should argue then that every state should use these focal points as part of their science standards. And then they could add the mud cracks or the periodic table or whatever they want to add. But then we'd have a national curriculum core, and we could concentrate a lot of effort on producing really good curriculum materials around that core. We could concentrate a lot of effort, like the Gates Foundation effort, about making really high quality assessments around that core. We could even visualize a subsidized set of assessments that subsidized by somebody, either foundation world or by incentives from the federal government or the state governments, basically to use these kinds of assessments designed around the focal points for these high-stakes exams. Again, it has to be a research project. We're not going to get it right the first time, but then we'd have something to work on. We'd have these, high-quality assessments we hope to start with. We would actually get outstanding researchers to look and talk to teachers and see what's happening with teaching and learning with these assessments. Teachers are going to teach them because they're high-stakes assessments. Then we could change them to make them better and keep evolving these assessments until they actually do what we need, which is to drive good teaching and learning. The assessments we have now tend to drive very bad teaching and learning. So, anything we did along these lines would improve where we're at now. So anyway, I think we can't give up. We've been, I spent 2 years on the National Science Education Standards, and I think, in fact, frankly, that the standards movement was a failure, despite all the fact that the standards were really a high-quality document. It was a failure because the next step, that taken by the states, messed things up. What happened in California, somebody with a lot of energy got on a bandwagon and got their voice heard. And this happened in other states as well. It's very hard to do this well, so I think it needs a national effort. And so I guess what I have to say is that given the new sort of sense of urgency in this issue, the spirit that Americans really want to do things right and recover from this incredible economic mess, and that it's a great time to get our very best people engaged in trying to redo this in a way that will make use of what we learned in the last, 12 years, and have another go at it, and I think we'll have a better chance of doing it in a better way.
Well, I think there's a lot of controversy about the issue of cloning human beings. Should we clone or not clone? Probably not. But if we were, I have a candidate, because I think that's probably what we're going to need, a whole army of these guys. Please thank our speaker, Bruce Alberts.